Now I'd like to introduce Kerri Kerr, Chief Operating Officer at Avalon. Kerri joined the Avalon team in 2005 after having worked with Avalon for years before that as the manager of annual giving programs at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Kerri brings deep analytical and strategic expertise, as well as very high EQ to everything she is part of. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you to get us started, Kerri.
Thanks, Joey. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Before we get started, I want to say how excited we are to have you here for what is our first educational webinar since Avalon joined the VeraData family. As we've come together, one of the things we're most excited about is the opportunity to bring even more ideas and expertise and perspectives to the organizations we serve. In a sector that is changing as quickly as ours is, we really believe it's important to create space for conversations that help nonprofit leaders understand not just what's happening today, but what's coming next. And today's topic is a great example of that. Last month, at the recommendation of our amazing Avalon Analytics team, Helen joined us at Avalon's annual retreat and shared this presentation with us. It sparked some of the most interesting conversations we had all week. Helen managed to challenge and broaden the thinking of a room full of veteran fundraisers, which is no small feat. As we listened, we kept saying to each other, our clients need to hear this too. And so here we are today. Helen is an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where she leads the organization's charity reform research. Her work focuses on the intersection of philanthropy, public policy, and inequality, including charitable mega giving, private foundations, and donor advised funds. She also brings deep expertise from her work with Target Analytics and Roy Solutions, where she helped nonprofits better understand donor behavior and charitable giving trends. Today, she'll help us explore an important shift happening in our sector. Charitable giving is increasingly coming from fewer and wealthier donors. And that raises some really important questions, like what does this mean for nonprofits? What does it mean for fundraising? And what should we be paying attention to as we plan for the future? So these are the exact kinds of trends and forces that we, as your partners, are thinking about every day and incorporating into our strategy recommendations. Because our role isn't just to execute campaigns, it's to help you understand the environment in which we are operating and build strategies that position your organizations for long-term success. So with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Helen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here to talk about my favorite topic. And thank you for that fantastic introduction, Kerri. I hope I can live up to the broadening the thinking of the group of veteran fundraisers because this Zoom is full of them. As Kerri said, I'm a data researcher for the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a progressive policy advocacy nonprofit focused on issues of inequality. And I'm also simultaneously pursuing a doctorate in data science at the University of Vermont because I have always been a data person, whether at IPS or at Target Analytics or at Roy Solutions or at the nonprofits I worked at before all of that. I've always been working on fundraising data, fundraising databases in one form or another. So when you think about your fundraising database person, those are the people I relate to. And this presentation is everything I know, as Kerri said, everything I know about fundraising and data and inequality and public policy from all of the places that I've worked over the past 35 years. So I'm going to start my screen. We will see if this works. I'm going to attempt to start my sharing. All right. Can you see my screen okay? Awesome. Okay. As the slide says, and as Kerri suggested, I will be talking about what has happened to charity over the past few decades, what it means for charities now. My hope is that it will give you context for what you are experiencing as a group, and I'm hoping that it will be relevant and will ring true and be helpful to you. And I have lots of material to get through, but I also want to leave, excuse me, plenty of time for questions. So put all those questions in the Q&A, and I will go as fast as I can without hopefully being incomprehensible. So we'll get to as many as we can. All right. So I thought we would start with some basics. This is as basic as you can get. This is top line charitable fundraising numbers from Giving USA. And a lot of you have probably seen Giving USA numbers. It's the big annual report that comes out every year. We're expecting the next report to come out in the next couple of weeks, I think June 23rd. And so at that point, we'll have 2025 numbers. But right now, this is the most up-to-date data we have, which is 2024. And the lighter bars are inflation adjusted dollars, and the dark blue line is not adjusted for inflation. So they're current dollars. And the first thing to note is top line is charities took in $593 billion in 2024. That's a lot of money. The charitable sector is about 10% of the workforce. So it's a big sector. It takes in a lot of revenue. But it hasn't been a smooth ride. You can see that it's not like a straight line of growth. There are booms and busts. There was a boom during the dot-com boom. It crashed a little bit after that. Hurricane Katrina in 2025 or 2005 brought that back up again. Then it went down during the the Great Recession in 2008, 2010. And then there's a COVID spike, which you can see, which for most people took place in 2021 because of when their fiscal years ended, but it was basically 2020 to 2021 spike. And all this goes to show that the University of Indiana researchers looked into this and said that the economy drives most of charitable giving. And they said that the three factors that drive charitable giving the most are income, wealth, and tax policy. So meaning tax policy, meaning what are the levels of charitable deductions that people can take for their giving. And then I superimposed individual giving over the top line numbers because I wanted you to see what a big proportion individual giving was of the overall giving amount. Because of the $593 billion that was given to charity in 2024, $392 billion of it came from individuals, as opposed to corporations, foundations, and bequests. So most of the time, what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation is individual giving because it's by far the biggest chunk. 2/3 of overall giving comes from individual people. And to continue the overall context, I wanted to show you charitable giving by sector. This is sort of my reprise of the target index. If anybody participated in that, I put together the Giving USA data from the past 40 years and put it on this graph because I didn't like the way they presented it. And I wanted to show you, basically give you the big picture for what is going on here, but also teach you how to look at it with a little bit of a critical eye. So when the next chapter comes out this year, you'll be able to look at it and sort of look behind the face value numbers. First of all, you'll see that the ups and downs basically parallel the overall trends. So the booms and busts and COVID surge and all that basically parallel what the overall sector is experiencing by and large. Some people think that the biggest story in here is that religion, which is the biggest sector of all, takes in the most money. That the story is that it's flattening out and making room for secular giving. I don't know that I necessarily, I don't know, we'll see what it does in the long term, but I wouldn't panic yet if I was a religious fundraiser. I think they're still doing fine. You'll also see the two biggest sectors, human services and education. But one thing to know about those two sectors is that the contributions going into them aren't necessarily spread out across the sector evenly. So both of those sectors include gigantic organizations like Salvation Army, United Way, Feeding America. Education includes places like Harvard, Stanford University, Johns Hopkins, which are getting the bulk of the revenue, so that when you look at those lines going up so high, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's spread out evenly across the organizations in that sector. Then the smallest sectors, arts, culture, humanity, animal welfare, environment, they're smallest, but they're also newer. So they haven't had a chance to build themselves up into the behemoth organizations that are in some of the other sectors. And finally, I colored foundations and public society benefit brightly because I wanted you to notice them. I wanted you to look at them and notice their growth. I'm not going to talk about them yet. We're going to come back to them because I need to give a little more context first before we talk about them. But just try to keep in the back of your brain that that's where those two sectors are, the yellow and the red. Okay, so even though I said that charitable giving has been going up and down as there have been harder times or better times, charitable giving has been remaining extremely consistent as a percent of people's personal disposable income for the past 60 years or more. This is as far back as the data goes, but it may be back even further. And what this means is that it goes up a tiny bit during booms, it goes down a tiny bit during hard times, but generally this is what people are able to spend on charity, is 2% of their disposable income. And it's incredibly consistent when you think about what other things you have to spend money on during the year, like healthcare costs or education costs. Those can go up and down wildly over the years, but this is incredibly consistent and it supports the idea that charity is driven by economic concerns. So when you have more to give, you give more. When you have less to give, you give less. And this 2% is the piece of the charitable pie that you are vying for, that chunk. While that is remaining consistent, the percent of income that is going to charity, the number of people who are giving to charity has dropped a lot. This is the percent of households giving to charity from the Philanthropy panel study, which is a subset of the University of Michigan panel study on income dynamics, which tracks people over time, the same group of people over time for all kinds of attributes. And they only do it every 2 years, which is why you're only seeing every 2 years on the graph. And they take forever to come out with their data. They do a really good job, but it takes them forever, which is why the most recent data we have right now is 2020. We're hoping this fall to get 2022. But what it shows, excuse me, what it shows is that charitable participation dipped below 50% for the first time ever in 2020. And that was in spite of the COVID surge that happened that year, which for a lot of organizations happened in that year. So that's really a big drop. And the Indiana researchers looked into it again, and they said they wanted to find out why people were stopping giving to charity. And they said 44%, sorry, I may have to take a drink of water. I was at a baseball game last night, so I was yelling. 44% of the donor decline is due to these economic factors together. So that is the biggest single factor. All of the others are less important and they're much tinier slices of the reason that people aren't giving. Now, I want to talk about what all that means, what the big picture of declining donors and consistent flat percent of disposable income means in the big picture. I want to put those pieces together for you. But I also want to take a little bit of a digression into tax policy because those can affect the way people give to charity too. And there have been two tax laws that passed in the past 10 years that affected what is happening with charities. The first one is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in 2017. It took effect in 2018, and it did two things related to charitable giving. One is that it doubled the standard deduction, and the other is that it capped state and local deductions at a lower level. So the University of Indiana researchers, again, they have a gigantic school of philanthropy that they do all these studies on what's happening with the nonprofit sector, including sending out Giving USA. So they looked into the effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and they said that what happens when you raise the standard deduction is anybody who used to be giving above the old standard deduction level, but below the new one, anybody who is in that sandwich, they don't have as much incentive to give to charity because they don't have to give it to take that much deduction. They can just take the standard deduction. And what it means is they're giving less to charity. So from that middle ground of people, they say they estimate that it's reducing giving by $20 billion a year, every year since it took effect in 2018. Now, the other tax law that took effect recently was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was passed last year, took effect this year, and that also did two things related to charity. One of them was they established a new universal deduction, which we at IPS have actually been pushing for because we believed that it would increase participation. It would make charitable giving more worthwhile for more people, a broader set of people. And then it also decreased deductibility, the deductibility cap of how much you are able to deduct from your income from 37% to 35%. And so the Indiana people again looked at it and they said, the universal deduction probably will have the effect of boosting participation, and they predicted that it would raise it to 52%, which at least is over 50. But they said that decreasing deductibility of charitable gifts probably will reduce giving by about $2.5 billion a year. So it's basically a wash. So you have these tax changes, which, if anything, are going to reduce the amount of revenue going to charities, and it's going to make it less worthwhile for people in that middle sandwich to give to charity, which means when you put that together with basically stagnating flat charitable revenue and charitable giving staying at 2% of personal disposable income and declining donors, you put all those things together, and what you get is charity is becoming more top heavy. What that means is charities are depending on revenue from a smaller number of donors. And those people are people who itemize, and that means those are people who are wealthier. So charities are depending more and more on wealthier donors. And I think a lot of us kind of suspected this for a while, but now we have all kinds of proof. There's evidence everywhere. This is just one piece of evidence. It's a little bit wonky. This is a graph I made of the IRS, the tax data, over time of what has happened to people at different income levels and how much of the charitable deductions in the country they're taking. So if you just look at the darkest blue bars at the bottom, it means that people who were making $1 million or more, they went from taking 15% of the charitable deductions in the country to taking 45% of the charitable deductions in this country. And on the other hand, the people making less than $200,000 a year went from 70% of the charitable deductions of this country to 27% of the charitable deductions. So what that means is that the people who are making more money are taking more of the deductions, which means they're giving more of the donations. Now, I said there were multiple pieces of evidence for this. This is another piece of evidence, which is mega donations from extremely wealthy people. These are mega donations that are tracked by Giving USA. And these are some of the guys who really like to give mega donations. And you can see that they're going up in general. They're very volatile because it gets affected by one person's gift a lot from year to year. But in general, it's been increasing. But also the threshold for what counts as a major gift, a mega gift, has been changing in Giving USA over the years. So in 2009, Giving USA said it takes a single one-time gift of $30 million to make it onto this graph. But in 2024, it takes a mega gift of $600 million to make it onto this graph because the amount of mega giving has just grown so much. So that means that this graph is actually more exaggerated than it looks like. because the scale is actually changing. All right, so why does this matter? Why do we care? If charities are giving revenue, why do we care where it comes from? I think there are several reasons why it matters. These are 5 of them. Number one is it's not the same amount of revenue. Charitable revenue is basically flat. If it hadn't been for the COVID surge, the last 8 years would be basically flat when you adjust for inflation. And we also know that we're losing $20 billion a year from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changes. So the mega gifts are not keeping up with the loss of the small and mid-level donors. The second reason is that when you depend more on your revenue from wealthier donors, it means that charities become haves and have-nots. So some charities get really lucky and they land some of these major mega gifts, and then others don't. And large charities are going to have an advantage in cultivating and landing the major gifts. And number 3, if there's anything I learned from my fundraising gurus, or some of who are in this Zoom, strong charities are best when they walk on many legs, when they have a broad diversity of supporters, they have a broad-based, diverse donor base, and their revenue is more predictable, it's less volatile, and they're less dependent on the whims of major donors to decide whether or not they're going to give to them in a given year. And that leads to number 4, which is when you rely on wealthier donors for more of your revenue, it means the wealthier donors have more control over what happens to that money. And then 5, this to me is a bigger, sort of more global reason, which is that charity, the US charity system is funded by public tax dollars because the money in it goes to the public benefit. And this is something I'd love you to be proud of because you are providing a public service. And it's a great system when it works. The trouble is when charity gets more top heavy, public benefit tends to take a back seat. So to dig into that a little bit more, this is the way it's supposed to work. So sorry for my drawings. I couldn't find a drawing. I don't like clip art and I didn't have a drawing that would work. But this was the way it was designed to work. That a donor gives a donation to a charity, they get a tax deduction. Because they got a tax deduction, they aren't putting as much tax revenue into the system, which means other taxpayers have to pay more or services get cut. So in a sense, those charitable deductions are subsidized by other taxpayers. And in the early 1900s, Congress realized this, and they realized it was a problem, and they said, in exchange for your tax deductions, you have to do 2 things. You have to, number 1, the money has to go towards a public benefit directly. And number 2, you have to give up what the tax code calls domain and control over what happens to the money. So you can't control what happens to the money anymore. It's up to the charity to decide what happens to it. That's the grand bargain, they call it sometimes. Tax deductions in exchange for money going to the public benefit, and you give up control over your donations. But there are ways to skirt the system. You don't have to memorize this chart. There are ways to skirt the system. There are ways, big incentives not to give to working charities, operating charities, and there are ways of giving and getting tax deductions while keeping control over money. So one example of that, this is one of the issues is that major and mega donors, the people at the top who are giving more and more and more of charitable revenue now, they tend not to give directly to operating charities. They tend to give to intermediaries. This is a Chronicle of Philanthropy graph of the donations from the top 50 philanthropists in the United States. Any of their donations over $1 million, this is where they sent them. And you notice how unbalanced it is. And notice the two top categories in this graph, foundations and donor advised funds. Those two are both intermediaries. And intermediaries meaning the donor puts money into them, they get a tax deduction right away, and then the money sits there in the intermediary until it gets granted out again in the form of grants to charity. That's what an intermediary is. So the wealthier the donor, the more they tend to give to intermediaries. This is very true for the top donors in the United States. It also is true for the ultra high net worth people and then major donors below that to lesser extents, but it's still a general pattern that you see. So now that I've said that, I want to go back to this graph and explain more about the yellow and the red lines because foundations and public society benefit. So foundations, private foundations, we now know are the #1 charity for the most wealthy donors in the United States. The #2 favorite charity for donors in the United States is donor advised funds. And Giving USA puts the largest national donor advised fund sponsors into the public society benefit sector. So when you look at that in the next report, it's not just ACLU, Common Cause, Planned Parenthood, HRC. It's also the largest national DAF sponsors are all in that sector, and they drive the trends for that sector. So I want to talk about them just a little bit more to sort of explain what's going on. So the first intermediary, private foundations, I'm not going to spend too much time on because most people have heard of them and have a rough understanding of how they work. Basically, the donor sets them up, gives them money, gets tax deductions, then the donor sits on the board, and every year the board meets and decides where the grants go out every year. And back in the 1920s, Congress was worried that the foundations that were being set up by wealthy families like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies, that they represented hoarding or disproportionate control over charitable money. So they said, in order for you to set up your foundation and get your tax deductions, you have to have some requirements on you. So one requirement is they have to pay out at least 5% of their assets to charity every year. Sort of. There are some loopholes, but we're not going to get into that in this presentation. They have to disclose their major donors, which is anybody over $5,000. And they also have to disclose their grants, which means you have a paper trail from the donor out to the recipient. And you can make sure that they're fulfilling their public charity purpose that way. There's sunlight. Also, they don't give their donors as big a tax deduction as if they were giving directly to charity. So if they gave directly to a charity, they'd be able to take the full allowable amount. But for a foundation, it's significantly lower. And usually you need about $1 million to set one up. So that's foundations. Donor advised funds, or DAFs. So you remember the way donations are supposed to work to charity. So donations, you get donations, tax deductions in exchange for the donation. So DAFs add a layer in between. And any 501c3 charity can set up a DAF program. Some of you, your organizations probably have DAF programs and you know all about how these work already. But in a DAF program, there are lots of little individual DAF accounts. And a donor gives a donation into one of these individual DAF accounts that they think of as theirs. It's their account. And they get a tax deduction for giving that money to the account because it's technically a donation to the 501c3 charity that is managing the account. Then the charity will grant the donor advisory privileges, which is where the donor advised part of this comes in. About they can recommend where grants go out and when they go out, and they can often recommend how the money is invested when it's sitting in the donor advised fund as well. And some people think of them because of this as charitable checking accounts, they're called, but they're managed by 501(c)(3)s instead of by banks. So this means that DEFs are really popular with donors more and more now, for a whole number of reasons. But there are some big differences between DAFs and foundations that are important. And one is because DAFs are actually 501(c)(3) charities, donors can take the full allowable amount of their charitable deductions, unlike with private foundations. It's just like they're giving to an operating charity. So that's one reason. Another reason is that the large national DAFs, especially, can handle liquidating donations of highly appreciated non-cash assets. And that can include things like stock and real estate, but it can also include artwork and antiquities and collectibles and grain futures and crypto. They can handle that, and that means the donor can avoid the capital gains taxes that they would have had to pay on that if they'd sold it instead. Also, a DEF will give a donor a huge amount of practical donor control without the overhead of a foundation. And the cherry on the top is there's no donor disclosure requirement. So a donor can be completely anonymous if they want to be, which is not true of private foundations. So those are all huge donor advantages. And as for the organization side, organizations, like I said, organizations managing DAFs can be any kind of 501(c)(3) charity. So Red Cross has one, has a DAF program. Stanford University has a DAF program. Public broadcasting stations often have DAF programs. And when you manage a DAF program, you're called a sponsor. So if I talk about sponsors, it just means a 501(c)(3) charity that is managing a DAF program. Now, they were started in the 1930s by community foundations, and they worked really well there. They were niche giving vehicles for community foundation donors who really wanted to have local expertise at grant making. So the donors would put money in, and then they would sit down with the staff at the community foundation and they would talk about where the best places in the community would be to give grants to. And it worked really well, kind of laid low that way for about 60 years. And then in 1991, investment banks started realizing that they could set up DAF programs too. And the way that that works is they set up a 501(c)(3) arm to take in donations to the DAF accounts. And then the money in those accounts has to be managed by somebody while it's sitting there. And corporate affiliated DEFs have a ready money manager right next door, or it could be in the same building. And so banks earn fees for managing the money that goes into donor advised funds and isn't granted out again right away. Bank relationship managers can often earn bonuses by the amount that is in their clients' donor advised funds at their sister bank. So this is a huge opportunity for investment banks to keep money in the DAF. They have a huge incentive to keep money in the DAF. And they arguably exert a subtle pressure with communications and recommendations, which means that it's hard to get money out of DAFs, even though it has been expressly set aside for charitable giving. And because there is no payout requirement, because the money has technically already been given to a 501(c)(3) charity, the sponsor, that money can sit there forever. And commercially affiliated sponsors have been aggressively marketing themselves as better alternatives than giving directly to operating charities. They're using the muscle of their marketing department to do that. So why is any of this relevant? Why am I talking about? I talk about DAFs all the time. Why am I talking about them? Because this is having a huge effect on charitable trends, and I don't feel like industry research talks about it that way. So one reason that it matters is money. And this is so in the beginning, I said that charitable donations to charity amounted to, from individuals, amounted to $392 billion in 2024. Donor advised fund sponsors took in $90 billion of that, which is 23%. So almost a quarter of all individual giving in the country went to donor advised funds. Now they took in just 4% 15 years ago. So they're growing incredibly fast. And this is happening as charitable revenue is stagnating, is basically flat, and as charitable giving is staying constant at 2% of personal disposable income, which means that as DAFs grow, they're not increasing the charitable pie, they're eating into the charitable pie. Okay. And DAFs, so payout essentially is the percent of your assets that you pay out to charitable grants every year. There is a lot of argument among different parties about the right formula to use to calculate what payout is for donor advised funds. There's no accepted standard except for arguably the IRS standard. And the thing is, because there's no requirement for DAFs to report on payout at the individual account level, we don't have any way of knowing what overall the typical DAF pays out at. We do know that if you look at all tax returns for all of the DAF sponsors in the country and put them all together, average payout is around in the 20s, the 20% range. But there have been a couple studies where specific states' attorneys general have been able to get access to account level information for nonprofits headquartered in that state. And they have reported that median payout, so the typical payout for the typical DAF account, is somewhere around 3 to 5%. And they found, depending on the study, that a fifth to a third of all DAF accounts pay out nothing in a given year. So if you combine DAF payout being pretty low with incredibly fast growing DAF asset portfolios, assets at DAFs right now are, I think it's $320 billion a year if you combine all DAFs together. If you combine those two things together, it means that DAFs are growing incredibly fast. And I want to set some context for those amounts. And I want to, we're going to look at how some of the biggest DAF sponsors stack up to some of the biggest operating charities in the country. So I want you to think about what you think are the top operating charities in the country. Like think about who is at the top in terms of how much money they take in every year. And then we're going to see how they stack up to the biggest donor advised fund sponsors in the country. So this is a little video that I made of the top 20 charities in the United States from 1990 to 2024, which is the most recent data I just got last week. So even the Avalon people haven't seen this yet. So they're going to be surprised. It takes 30 seconds. So we're just going to watch what happens. The blue bars, the light blue bars, are the operating charities. The orange bars, when they come in, are going to be the DAFs, which for these purposes and for Giving USA's purposes are any sponsor where DAFs make up 80% or more of their total assets. So they have to have a huge proportion of their assets in DAFs in order to be orange on this chart. And most of them are up in the 90s. Most of them are up in the 90s. So we start in 1990 with the United Way was earning more than $3 billion. And I'm going to start it. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, we're just going to watch. There's the first DAF. Okay, so often people are surprised when they find out that the top five charities aren't actually operating charities. Last year it was three, now it's five, and they make up 11 of the top 20. So they're making huge inroads and they're getting bigger all the time. So I just want you to know that for context. All right. Now, I just have one more thing that's about money that I thought might be interesting for this group to know if you don't know already, which you may, which is that DAFs are they are the mechanism behind the largest nonprofit crowdfunding programs in the country. So right now, the PayPal Giving Fund is a DAF sponsor, and they are the machinery behind the 501c3 promotional crowdfunding campaigns for GoFundMe, eBay, Meta, Instagram. GoFundMe is actually setting up their own DAF, so they're going to split off and have their own program. But for now, everybody's on PayPal. And the way that it works is that PayPal Giving Fund has a list of 2,000 charities on what they call their registered list. And if you are not on their list, they give the donor's contribution to a charity that is similar, they say. And they can take months to send the gift out. And all of that is entirely legal because they are a sponsor. They have a 501c3, and the donor gave the money to the PayPal Giving Fund, not to the charity that they designated in their form. Now, in 2017, there was a class action lawsuit. 23 states attorneys general filed suit against PayPal Giving Fund, saying this wasn't made clear on the websites of these crowdfunding campaigns. And so they settled in 2020. PayPal promised to make it clear. If you go into the websites of these various crowdfunding places, they will eventually have fine print that tells you that this is how it works. But in my mind, it's still extremely hard to find. Okay, so all of that stuff is about money. There are just two other little issues I wanted to talk about with DAFs, just briefly. And I think actually this one is about how having a DAF program may affect charities that manage them, but I think I'm actually going to skip this for time. We can come back to it in the Q&A if anybody is interested in talking about that. But because I'm more interested in talking about this one, which is accountability. And that is that I mentioned before that DAFs have no donor disclosure requirements whatsoever. Sponsors don't have to disclose their donors, not even to the IRS, not even to the charity recipients themselves. So there's no paper trail from donor to ultimate recipient. And what that means is DAFs are one of the biggest ways now that dark money happens. So if you wanted to give a gift to charity that you didn't want anybody to be able to track, you could do it by giving to a DAF. Then you could direct the DAF to give to the charity. Then the charity can lobby for anti-tax legislation, anti-DEI legislation, anti-immigrant legislation, pick your favorite topic, or the charity can subsidize their 501c4 arms, which can do unlimited lobbying and a certain amount of electioneering to elect the candidates that the donors want. Or the C4 can subsidize the 527, which can do unlimited amounts of electioneering. So it is a way that dark money can funnel its way through the system and not be traced back to the donor. And these are some examples of some of the people who have investigative journalists suggest that they may be using this line of funding. So this is a little depressing, I know, but I firmly believe that it can get better. And this list is just a very, very partial list of the kinds of things that could be done to the system to improve things on the issues that I've been talking about: transparency, equity, accountability. And There have been some, these are the things that my organization is working on. Others are working on it. There have also been some legislative and regulatory attempts to change things. I don't know if any of you followed the ACE Act in the Senate in 2021 and 2022. And there was also IRS regulations proposed in the budget in 2023 and 2024. All of those things would have put significant restrictions on donor advised funds and or private foundations in different ways to improve transparency and accountability and increase the flow of money going directly to public charities. All of those efforts were beaten down by deaf advocates when they happened, but this is actually an issue that through those efforts, we have seen that both right and left politicians support. So IPS, for example, is a progressive organization, but we have worked with people who I never thought in my wildest dreams I would be allied with because we agree on this issue. And they may have different reasons, but we share similar goals. So that actually gives me a lot of hope that even when things are extremely partisan, charitable reform actually has a shot of happening. And I'm getting to the end. So as a way, what I wanted to give you towards the end was for what it's worth, I wanted to offer some suggestions and some resources for what to do. So as the first of the suggestions, strategically, my hope overall, I think the biggest thing is education. I feel like my hope is that people will understand the context that we're in, that you will understand the water that you're swimming in. And I really believe that's important because working charities, operating charities, really have the power to reset the narrative. So you have stories, you have a powerful voice in this. You are directly connected to missions, you're directly connected to people. You don't postpone relief and action, and people love you. Your donors love you, even people who don't donate to you love you. So you have a real powerful voice in this. And many DAF donors also do genuinely care about your missions and want to give money to you. I think they're just swayed a little bit by the DAF industry. So I think that there is a lot of motivation out there to help. I know I'm running short of time, but remind them that there's no substitute for giving directly to charities on the ground doing the work. I'm going to whip through these practical suggestions. One is remember that small and mid-level donors are your seed corn. They are feeding your major donor program. It's not just about major donors. Loyalty programs are a great way for that. SB would kill me if I didn't mention sustainer giving programs as a way to solidify your loyalty. Give donors as many ways and opportunities to give to you as possible. Let them pick the way, but also suggest DAFs as an option for giving. Also let them know if you know you have major donors who might be giving through DAFs. Most DAFs, two-thirds of DAFs default their donors to be partially or completely anonymous, and the donor doesn't often even know. So tell your donors that that might be happening. Remember that DAF donors are your major donors and that traditional cultivation still works to find, cultivate, solicit them. I put Mackenzie Scott in here because she might be the world's best DAF donor. She gives all her giving through DAFs to preserve the anonymity, not of her, but of the recipients. And she has 100% turnaround rate, payout rate every year. She puts money in, puts it all out. So those are practical suggestions. And then finally, resources. I split up into resources for charities, resources for donors. My number one resource for charities is the Philanthropy Project, which is a program that was started last year by the former heads of Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and Cal Nonprofits. And they are working on legislative and policy reform at the federal and state level, addressing these issues. Voulet also talks about all these issues, but he's hilarious and funny and spicy about it. He's a great alternative nonprofit blog. Crappy fundraising practices is very spicy. I'll let you figure them out. For donors, I would recommend Edgar Villanueva. If you're ever talking to major donors who you know have DAFs, Edgar Villanueva has this program called Reparative Philanthropy Project, which the goal is to move big charitable money to traditionally disenfranchised groups. He does a great job at that, and he works with DAFs too. Half My DAF is a pledge developed by Jen and David Risher. David Risher is the CEO of Lyft, and they have a pledge that donors can take to say, I'm going to give away half of my DAF at least every year. And then for those who are the most outspoken, I welcome you to get in touch with us at the IPS Charity Reform Initiative. This is my team, and we're working hard on trying to get legislative reform, actual bills through Congress that will address these things. So that's it. Sorry, that last bit was very fast.
That was great,
I'm
Helen.
gonna, sure, I can stop sharing too. Here, I'll stop sharing.
We have a few questions in the Q&A that I can bring up now. The first question was, I think you made reference to if you have a DAF program, and someone was asking, what do you mean by that? That they accept DAF donations, but they don't know if that means that they have a DAF program.
You do. If you accept DAF donation. Oh, you mean, oh, I see what you're saying. No, you have a DAF program if you run and manage DAFs. Sorry, if you are a sponsor. That's a great question, though. If you accept DAF gifts, that can be anybody. You can take gifts from DAFs all over.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it's not only just accepting DAPs, you can go a step further, and that was one of Avalon's key takeaways, was a responsibility to really be actively soliciting donors to make grants from their DAPs, and to move that money to our clients' programs. So look
Exactly.
for that in increasing strategy recommendations from Avalon and VeraData. There was another question that said, what about this whole situation where some of the big commercial DAFs are refusing to pass along grants to organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center? Can they do that?
Yes. Yes, the short answer is yes, they can do that. Yeah, there's this situation where, so the SPLC is under indictment by the administration right now. And because of that, the three biggest commercial DAFs, so Fidelity, Schwab, and Vanguard, are refusing to pass along grants that their donors recommend going to the SPLC. And a lot of people are outraged about this. I understand why people are outraged. The donors gave money and they expected to be able to give the money where they wanted to. But on the other hand, it is totally legal for the sponsors to hold back the money and do what they want because they own the money. And I think it may be that the donors are just now realizing that. Like they're just realizing the nature of that beast. And I won't go on and on and on about this too much, but the biggest sponsors, the commercially affiliated ones, they don't have a charitable mission the same way that a normal operating charity does. So that I think they're more subject to sort of market forces and self-preservation. And I think they may more likely to be able to decide it's in my interest to not give to something that the administration will object to, whereas a charity with a strong mission might be more likely to say it's the principle of the thing. And in my view, I know there's a lot more that to be said, and this might sound kind of snarky, but if they had given directly to the SPLC, they wouldn't be having this problem.
Absolutely. One of the last questions is, what advice would you give to charities that have their own DAF program?
So this is where, okay, so this is the slide I skipped over. Let me see if I can go back. This is always dicey. Okay, can you see my screen? No,
Not yet.
not yet. Okay,
Now it's coming.
okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so there hasn't been a lot of research on what happens to the charities that sponsor DAFs. But this is a paper that I wrote with my wonderful co-author, Brian Mittendorf, who's an accounting professor at Ohio State. And we looked at community foundations. And we wanted to see if the bigger your DAF program, how would that affect their giving? And we found basically that the bigger your DAF program was, the less likely you are as a community foundation to give grants in your local area. So this is just an example. This is California-based sponsors, and on the left are the ones with the small DAF programs, and on the right are the ones with the big DAF programs. And you can see the dispersion is way bigger when you have a bigger DAF program, even though their express mission is to make grants in their local California area. So there's no, we don't have causal information about this, but what we would say is, or I would say at least, I don't want to speak for Brian, but that if you have a significant part of your donor program that is primarily driven by donor decisions, it can subtly nudge you away from spending your resources on your mission and on theirs instead. And it sort of implies that when you have a DAF program, when you run a DAF program, when you manage the accounts, you have a tiger by the tail.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm sharing again. All right.
All right. Well, I think we are pretty much at time. We want to say thank you to everybody for joining us, and thank you, Helen, for bringing this important perspective to us. I think we all see that money sitting in those DAF accounts, and our marching orders are to go get it out of those accounts and putting it to work for our clients' missions. So we hear that loud and clear and really appreciate you bringing this to all of us, and hope everybody has a great afternoon. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.